Question number 2. Aphids are tiny insects that feed on plants, such as cabbage plants. A farmer wants to reduce the number of aphids in a cabbage field. A river is located 100 meters south of the cabbage field. The farmer divides the field into 25 regions of equal size, as shown in the diagram. So you can see here. So there are 25 regions, and there are some regions which is 100 meters from the river, and some regions are closer to farmer's house. So each region has approximately the same number of cabbage plants. The farmer would like to estimate the proportion of cabbage plants in the field that are affected by aphids. Now, that might be one important information right here. What is he trying to estimate? The proportion of cabbage plants in the field that are affected by aphids, and believes that the extent of aphid damage is greater for the regions in the cabbage fields closer to the river. So that might be another piece of important information, the variable that can affect the aphid damage, which is the proximity to the river. To obtain the estimate, the farmer is considering 3 sampling methods. So they've listed 3 different sampling methods. Let's move on to part A. Part A is asking, explain whether sampling method 1 is an appropriate sampling method for the farmer to use to estimate the proportion of cabbage plants in the field that are damaged by aphids. Now let's look at sampling method 1. Select region 3, which is closest to the farmer's house and farthest from the river. So region 3, so that's right there. Examine every cabbage plant in the region for aphid damage. Now, is it an appropriate sampling method? So by looking at this, you can see this is an example of a convenience sampling, and convenience sampling is never a good method of sampling. It always leads to either underestimate or overestimate the parameter. So now how are we going to word this? So let's add some context. So this sampling method will not be appropriate for estimating. What is our context? For estimating the proportion of cabbage plants in the field that are damaged by aphids. And now explain why. As region 3 is, so what is one variable that can affect this? The proximity to the river, because region number 3 is farthest from the river, and the sample size is also too small. So it is given that the extent of aphid damage is greater for the regions in the field closer to the river. So therefore, the sample will not accurately represent the population, and the estimated proportion from region 3 will be an underestimate, far below the true proportion. Part B. Using sampling method 2, the farmer randomly selected row E and examined every cabbage plant in row E. Now let's look at row E. So that's row E. If the farmer belief is correct, determine whether the selection of row E is likely to provide an overestimate or an underestimate of the proportion of cabbage plants in the field that are damaged by aphids. Justify your answer. So if you look at sampling method 2, it says randomly select one row, A, B, C, D, or E. For every region in the selected row, examine every cabbage plant for aphid damage. So this is a classic example of cluster sampling. You're dividing the field into clusters like A, B, C, D, and E, and then randomly select one of the clusters and examine every cabbage plant in that cluster. So now if you look at the cluster, which is row E, so every region which is closer to the river, so it's likely to provide an overestimate of the proportion of cabbage plants affected by aphids because it's closer to the river. Now let's just word this. Now, though this method consists of more than one region compared to method 1, so the sampling size is more, all the regions in row E are closer to the river, leading to a less heterogeneous sample. The estimated proportion of cabbage plants affected by aphids, so we added some context there, is likely to be an overestimate, and the reason is the plants are closer to the river are more likely to be damaged by aphids. Part C. Using the information provided in the diagram of the cabbage field, Describe how to implement sampling method 3, which requires a random selection of one region from each of rows A, B, C, D, and E. So let's see what is sampling method 3. So you randomly select one region from each of the rows, A, B, C, D, and E. And for each selected region, examine every cabbage plant for aphid damage. So now, this is an example of stratified random sampling. That means you are dividing the field into stratas, into groups A, B, C, D, and E, based on its proximity to the river. And then use a random sampling method to choose one region from each strata, and then examine all the cabbage plants in those regions. So this is one of the best methods to get the closest estimate to the true proportion. So the question is, how do we implement this? So whenever you're doing a random sampling, the first thing is to assign numbers to the individuals. So the step number 1 would be choose row A and assign numbers 1 to 5 to each region in that row. And the next is you have to use some change process. It could be using slips of paper, or it could be using random number generator or a spinner. So here I'm going to use a random number generator. So use a random number generator to generate a number between 1 to 5. So pick the region corresponding to the number generated. So that is your first sample. And then step number 3 is repeating the process for B, C, D, and E. For B, you will generate a number between 6 and 10, and then pick the region that is associated with the number that is generated. And you get another sample. So in the end, you will have 5 fields, and you will get more of a heterogeneous sample compared to any other sampling methods listed here.